My name is Adela, 35 years old, and I woke up from an 8-month coma to find myself completely alone in a sterile hospital room. No flowers on the bedside table, no get-well cards, not a single family member sleeping in the uncomfortable visitor's chair. But what shocked me more was when 12 members of my family suddenly appeared with tears and bouquets after abandoning me for months. Before I share what brought them running back, where are you watching from? Please hit that like button and subscribe if you believe family should be there through thick and thin. 8 months before that lonely awakening, I lived in Houston, Texas, surrounded by what I thought was a loving, if complicated, family. My father, Robert, 62 years old, had spent his entire life chasing one failed business venture after another. From frozen yogurt franchises to cryptocurrency investments, he had a talent for losing money faster than most people could earn it. He would show up at my apartment at least once a month with a new scheme and a familiar request for startup capital. My mother, Patricia, 60 years old, cared more about appearances than anything else. She spent her days at the country club not because she enjoyed golf or tennis, but because she needed to maintain her image among Houston's social circles. She would constantly remind me that my single status at 35 was becoming an embarrassment to the family. According to her, my success meant nothing without a husband and children to show for it. Diana, my older sister at 38, had married well, or so she liked to remind everyone. Her husband came from old oil money, and she lived in River Oaks, in a house that cost more than most people would earn in a lifetime. Yet beneath her designer clothes and perfect smile, she harbored a deep resentment toward me. She couldn't understand how her younger sister, the one who didn't marry rich, could afford a nice car and a downtown condo. Marcus, my 40-year-old brother, had a gambling problem that everyone pretended didn't exist. He worked as a real estate agent, but most of his commissions went straight to poker tables and sports betting. He had borrowed money from me 47 times in the past 5 years. I kept count in a small notebook, not because I expected to get it back, but because I needed to remind myself of the pattern. Kevin, the baby of the family at 32, had never held a job for more than 6 months. He lived in our parents' pool house, claiming he was developing a podcast that would make him famous. In 3 years, he had recorded exactly 4 episodes, none of which had more than 12 downloads, and 8 of those were from me. I worked as a senior accountant at Preston Financial, one of Houston's largest firms. That was my public job, the one everyone knew about. What they didn't know was that 5 years ago, I had started an AI technology company with 2 college friends. We worked nights and weekends, pouring every spare dollar and minute into developing predictive analytics software for healthcare systems. I kept it secret, not because I didn't trust my family, but because I had watched them destroy every good thing with their endless needs and drama. Over the past decade, I had given my family over $200,000. Emergency car repairs for Kevin that turned into weekend trips to Austin, medical bills for Mum that became spa treatments, business investments for Dad that evaporated into nothing, loans to Marcus that disappeared at casino tables. Every time I helped, they promised it would be the last time. Every time I believed them, I became a little more foolish. They only called when they needed something. My birthday would pass without a single text, but the moment someone needed rent money, my phone would ring. I wasn't invited to Diana's anniversary parties or Mum's country club events. I was too boring, too focused on work, too single to fit their image of a proper family member. Dad would introduce me to his golf buddies as his daughter, who was good with numbers, never mentioning my actual accomplishments. The previous year, on my 34th birthday, I had waited all day for someone to remember. I had even cleared my schedule, thinking maybe they had planned a surprise. By 9 that evening, sitting alone in my condo with a cupcake I had bought myself, I realized the only surprise was my continuing ability to hope for something different. That night, I made a decision. Once my company went public or got acquired, I would tell them about my success. Maybe then they would see me as more than an ATM with a pulse. The universe had other plans. 3 weeks before the accident, Global Health Systems had approached us with an offer to buy 45% of our company for $850 million. My share would be worth over $400 million after taxes. We had spent weeks in negotiations, reviewing contracts and planning the transition. March 15th was supposed to be the day everything changed. That morning arrived with perfect spring weather in Houston. I left my condo at 7:30, planning to arrive at the lawyer's office early to review the final documents one more time. The radio played something cheerful as I merged onto Interstate 45, thinking about how I would finally tell my family the truth. Maybe I would take them to dinner at their favorite steakhouse, the expensive one they only went to when Diana's husband was paying. I never saw the 18-wheeler that had crossed the median. Witnesses later said the driver had fallen asleep after driving for 16 straight hours. He had veered across 3 lanes of oncoming traffic before hitting my Toyota Camry head-on. The impact pushed my car into 2 other vehicles before it finally came to rest against the barrier, crumpled beyond recognition. The paramedics said I was lucky to be alive. Lucky seemed like a strange word for someone with massive head trauma, a collapsed lung, broken ribs, and internal bleeding. They rushed me to Memorial Hermann Hospital, where a team of surgeons worked for 9 hours to save my life. When they finally wheeled me into the ICU, I was in a deep coma, with machines breathing for me, and monitors tracking every vital sign. My emergency contact was my mother, and the hospital called her immediately. Within 2 hours, my entire family had gathered in the waiting room. Diana cancelled a shopping trip to Dallas. Marcus left a poker game with a winning hand. Kevin actually put on clean clothes. Dad drove Mum to the hospital, breaking several traffic laws along the way. For those first critical hours, they looked like the perfect devoted family. Dr. Sarah Martinez, my neurologist, met with them that first evening. She explained that I had suffered a severe traumatic brain injury. The swelling in my brain was significant, and they had induced a deeper coma to allow my body to heal. When Mum asked about my chances of recovery, Dr. Martinez was honest but not encouraging. 30% chance of waking up with full cognitive function, 40% chance of waking up with some impairment, 30% chance of never waking up at all. For the first week, they maintained their vigil. Diana brought expensive coffee for everyone each morning. Marcus read sports scores aloud, saying he had heard that coma patients could sometimes hear familiar voices. Kevin downloaded meditation music, claiming it would help my brainwaves. Mum held my hand and prayed, though I had never known her to be particularly religious. Dad sat quietly in the corner, occasionally clearing his throat as if preparing to say something important before changing his mind. By the second week, the cracks began to show. Diana complained that the hospital parking was costing her $40 a day. Marcus mentioned that he was missing important client meetings. Kevin discovered that the hospital Wi-Fi wasn't strong enough for gaming, and Mum worried that people at the club were starting to gossip about our family's tragedy. The visiting hours that had once seen all 5 of them now saw 2 or 3, then just 1 or 2. During the 3rd week, they had a family meeting in the hospital cafeteria. I know this because Maria, my day shift nurse, overheard them and later wrote about it in the journal she kept. They discussed the cost of my care, even though my excellent health insurance covered everything. They talked about the burden of driving to the medical center every day. Diana suggested they create a visiting schedule so no one would have to come more than twice a week. Everyone quickly agreed. By the end of the first month, the schedule had fallen apart. Mum came on Tuesdays for exactly 15 minutes, always checking her phone for messages from her tennis partners. Dad stopped coming altogether, claiming it was too hard to see me that way. Diana sent flowers, once grocery store carnations, with a generic get-well card. Marcus discovered my wallet in the personal belongings bag and took my ATM card. Kevin posted a photo of me on social media, asking for thoughts and prayers, then used the sympathy to try to get dates. The second month of my coma passed with even less family presence. Mum reduced her visits to every other week, staying just long enough to ask the nurses if there had been any change. When they said no, she would pat my hand awkwardly and leave relief visible on her face. She told her country club friends that she was maintaining a constant bedside vigil, even posting old photos of herself in my hospital room to maintain the fiction. Marcus had successfully guessed my ATM PIN, my birthday, that the family never remembered, and withdrew the maximum daily amount for 2 weeks straight. $50,000 disappeared from my savings account before the bank's fraud department finally froze the card. When they called my emergency contact about suspicious activity, Mum told them everything was fine, that the family was just taking care of necessary expenses while I was indisposed. Diana visited once during the 3rd month, bringing her husband Richard, so he could see what she was dealing with. They stood at the foot of my bed discussing vacation plans for the summer, debating between Cabo and the Bahamas. Richard suggested they use my condition as an excuse to skip his family reunion. Diana agreed, saying no one could expect them to travel during such a difficult time. They left after 12 minutes without speaking a single word directly to me. Kevin posted regular updates on social media about his brave struggle with having a sister in a coma. He gained over 1,000 followers who sent him supportive messages and occasionally money through various payment apps. He used the funds to upgrade his gaming setup, telling anyone who asked that keeping busy helped him cope with the tragedy. He hadn't actually visited since the first month. By month 4, I had become a ghost to them, present only when convenient for their narratives. Dad told his golf buddies that I was recovering nicely in a private facility, implying they were paying for premium care. Mum accepted sympathy lunches, where other women paid the check, and listened to her manufactured stories of devotion. They had mourned me without me actually dying, finding it easier to grieve a memory than maintain a relationship with reality. What none of them knew was that Maria Elena Gonzalez, a 28-year-old nurse from Brownsville, had become my guardian angel. She worked 4 12-hour shifts a week, and during each one, she spent her breaks and lunch hours with me. She had noticed my family's absence by the second month and took it upon herself to ensure I wasn't alone. Maria talked to me during every shift, telling me about her own life, her struggles to pay for her younger brother's college tuition, her dreams of becoming a nurse practitioner. She read to me from books she thought I might enjoy, mysteries and thrillers with strong female protagonists. She brought fresh flowers from her own garden, bright zinnias and marigolds that filled the sterile room with colour and life. She exercised my arms and legs beyond what physical therapy required, massaging my muscles to prevent atrophy. She braided my hair and kept it clean, applied lip balm to prevent chapping, and made sure my nails were trimmed and neat. When other nurses asked why she spent so much unpaid time with a patient, she would simply say that everyone deserved dignity and care regardless of whether their family provided it. On holidays, Maria decorated my room with handmade decorations. Paper turkeys for Thanksgiving, tissue paper flowers for Easter, tiny American flags for the 4th of July. She brought her guitar once and played soft Mexican folk songs, the same ones her grandmother had sung to her as a child. She treated me not as a comatose patient, but as a friend who simply couldn't respond yet. She also protected my belongings with fierce determination. When she discovered Marcus had taken my ATM card, she moved my remaining valuables to the hospital safe and changed the access code. She kept my laptop and phone charged, checking them periodically for important messages. It was this vigilance that would eventually change everything. During month 5, Maria noticed that my phone received dozens of emails from someone named Thomas Henderson, marked as urgent and important. She didn't read them, respecting my privacy, but she made note of the sender's name and the persistence of his attempts to reach me. By month 6, when the emails had turned to voicemails expressing serious concern, she began to worry that something significant was being missed. The complete abandonment came gradually but thoroughly. By month 6, no one from my family had visited in over 30 days. Mum sent a text to the nurses' station once asking for an update, but she didn't wait for a response. Diana told people I had been transferred to a long-term facility in another state, a lie that absolved her of visiting obligations. Marcus had moved on to other sources of money, having exhausted what he could steal from me. Kevin had stopped posting about me entirely, my tragedy no longer generating enough engagement for his social media aspirations. Dad had perhaps the most honest response, though he would never admit it. He simply pretended I had never existed, removing my photos from his office and telling new acquaintances he had 3 children instead of 4. It was easier for him to erase me than to confront his failure as a father. When his brother asked about me during a phone call, Dad said I was traveling for work and changed the subject. Everything changed on a humid Tuesday morning in the 7th month of my coma. Thomas Henderson, senior partner at Henderson, Blake & Associates, arrived at the hospital looking like a man on a mission. He wore an expensive suit despite the Houston heat and carried a leather briefcase that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. He had been trying to reach me for over 6 months first about final contract details, then with increasing concern about my complete silence. Thomas had overseen the entire global health acquisition, working with me through countless late nights to ensure every detail was perfect. When I had suddenly disappeared without signing the final paperwork, he had initially assumed I had gotten cold feet about the deal. But as weeks turned to months with no response to emails, calls, or even registered letters, he knew something was seriously wrong. He started his search by calling my office at Preston Financial, where he learned I had been on medical leave since March. Human Resources wouldn't provide details citing privacy concerns, but a sympathetic colleague mentioned a serious car accident. Thomas then spent 2 days calling Houston hospitals until he finally found me at Memorial Hermann, listed as a long-term coma patient in the ICU. When he arrived at my bedside, Maria was there reading to me from a mystery novel during her lunch break. She initially assumed he was a family member, the first to visit in months, and her face lit up with happiness that someone had finally come. When Thomas explained he was my attorney, her expression shifted to confusion, then surprise, when he mentioned the company and the acquisition. Thomas asked to speak with my family, assuming they had been managing my affairs during my incapacitation. Maria's bitter laugh told him everything he needed to know. She explained how my family had abandoned me, how she had been my only consistent visitor for months, how they had even stolen money from my accounts while I lay unconscious. Thomas listened with growing anger and disbelief. He then revealed what my family had never bothered to discover. 3 days before my accident, I had digitally signed the preliminary acquisition documents. The $850 million deal had gone through automatically when I didn't object within the specified time frame. For 7 months, $400 million had been sitting in an escrow account, waiting for my final signature to be released. The other partners had received their shares months ago. Maria nearly dropped the book she was holding. She stared at Thomas, then at me, then back at Thomas. She asked him to repeat the number, certain she had misheard. When he confirmed the amount, she sat down heavily in the visitor's chair, understanding finally why I had worked such long hours, why I had driven that modest Toyota Camry despite obviously being able to afford better, why my family's abandonment was even more cruel than she had imagined. Thomas needed to contact my family as my legal next of kin to arrange for power of attorney or wait for me to wake up. Maria provided Mum's phone number from my emergency contact information, warning Thomas about what kind of people he would be dealing with. He thanked her, left his business card, and promised to handle everything carefully. The call to my mother came at 2:15 that afternoon. She was at the country club having lunch with her tennis group when her phone rang. She almost didn't answer the unknown number, but something made her excuse herself and step onto the terrace. Thomas introduced himself as my attorney and asked if she was sitting down. She wasn't, but she said she was already irritated at having her lunch interrupted. When Thomas explained about the acquisition and the amount of money involved, Mum's scream could be heard across the entire country club dining room. She collapsed onto a decorative bench, hyperventilating, while Thomas waited patiently on the line. When she could finally speak, she peppered him with questions, her voice shaking with a combination of shock and barely concealed greed. Within 15 minutes, she had called Dad, who was on the golf course, and drove his cart directly to the parking lot, leaving his partners mid-game. Diana received the call during a Pilates class and ran out still wearing her workout clothes. Marcus was at a casino but immediately cashed out his chips and drove toward the hospital. Kevin actually ran from the pool house to the main house, something no one had seen him do in years. The family group text exploded with messages. How much money exactly? Was it real? Why hadn't I told them? Who else knew? Could they access it if I never woke up? That last question typed by Marcus sat unanswered while the others processed its cold implications. Diana finally responded that they needed to be at the hospital immediately, all of them, and they needed to look like they had been there all along. Within 90 minutes, my hospital room was fuller than it had been since the first day of my coma. They arrived with flowers, balloons, teddy bears, and get-well cards dated weeks earlier. Mum brought a blanket from home, which she dramatically draped over my legs while crying about her poor baby. Dad stood by my bedside, holding my hand, the same hand he hadn't touched in 5 months. They immediately began harassing the medical staff for updates, demanding to know why they hadn't been informed of any changes in my condition. Dr. Martinez, who had witnessed their absence for months, could barely contain her disgust, as Mum claimed they had been visiting at different times and must have just missed each other. The duty nurse pulled up the visitor logs on her tablet, showing clearly that no family had visited in over 2 months, but Mum insisted the system must be malfunctioning. Diana took charge of redecorating my room, sending Kevin to the gift shop to buy everything that looked expensive. Within hours, my previously sparse room looked like a flower shop had exploded. Marcus set up a rotating schedule where someone would always be present just in case I woke up, or more importantly, in case Thomas returned. They wanted to appear as the devoted family they had never been. The most dramatic change was their sudden interest in my medical care. Mum demanded meetings with every specialist, insisting on second opinions and experimental treatments. Dad researched traumatic brain injury recovery on his phone, quoting statistics to anyone who would listen. They hired a private neurologist to review my case, hoping for any sign that I might wake up soon and, more importantly, be competent to sign financial documents. Maria watched all of this unfold from the nurse's station, her journal filling with observations about their transparent greed. They had pushed her out of my room, telling her that family would handle my care from now on. When she tried to explain that she had been caring for me for months, Diana dismissed her with a wave, saying that hired help was no longer necessary. Maria wanted to scream that she had never been paid that she had cared, because she actually cared, but she knew it would fall on deaf ears. The 8th month of my coma began, with my family maintaining their charade of devotion. They had established a complex rotation that ensured someone was always present, though they spent most of their time on their phones researching luxury cars and real estate listings. Marcus had already picked out a yacht he planned to buy with his share of my money. Kevin had designed business cards for his new production company, funded by what he considered his rightful inheritance. They brought in specialist after specialist, each one giving the same prognosis that Dr. Martinez had given months earlier. My brain activity showed improvement, but there was no way to predict when or if I would wake up. The swelling had reduced significantly, and my body had healed from the other injuries, but consciousness remained elusive. Mum grew increasingly frustrated with each doctor who couldn't give her a definitive timeline. On a Thursday morning, something shifted. I don't remember the exact moment of waking, but Maria, watching from the hallway, later told me that my fingers moved first. Just a small twitch that could have been involuntary, except it was followed by another, then another. My eyelids fluttered like butterfly wings, testing their strength. The monitor showing my brain activity suddenly spiked with new patterns. Diana was in the room scrolling through vacation rentals in Tuscany on her phone and almost missed it entirely. When she finally looked up and saw my eyes starting to open, she dropped her phone and started screaming for nurses. Within seconds, my room was full of medical staff pushing my family back as they assessed my condition. Dr. Martinez was paged and arrived within minutes, hardly believing what she was seeing. Coming back to consciousness felt like swimming up from the bottom of a deep, dark ocean. Sounds came first, muffled and distorted like hearing through water, then light, painful and bright, making me want to retreat back into the darkness. Slowly, shapes became faces, and faces became familiar, though something felt wrong about their presence that my foggy brain couldn't quite grasp. Mum's face appeared above me, tears streaming down her perfectly made-up cheeks. She clutched my hand, telling me how they had never left my side, how they had prayed every single day for my return. Dad stood behind her, nodding solemnly, his eyes already calculating something I was too confused to understand. Diana sobbed dramatically in the corner, while Marcus and Kevin competed to look the most concerned. Dr. Martinez ran through a series of cognitive tests, checking my responses and reflexes. I could squeeze her hand on command, follow a light with my eyes, and understand basic questions, though my throat was too dry and damaged from months of intubation to speak. She declared it a miracle, said my recovery was better than anyone could have hoped. My family cheered and hugged each other, their relief palpable but somehow performative. Over the next 3 days, as my strength slowly returned and the feeding tube was removed, my family maintained their constant presence. They told elaborate stories about their dedication during my coma. Diana claimed she had quit her job to focus on my care, though I knew she had never worked a day in her life. Marcus said he had spent every evening reading to me, despite Maria's journal clearly stating no one had read to me except her. Mum brought photo albums pointing to pictures and telling me stories I already knew, as if trying to trigger memories she assumed were lost. She kept mentioning how confused I must be, how the trauma might have affected my memory, clearly, hoping I had forgotten about the money entirely. Dad had already brought papers for me to sign, just formalities, he said, to help manage things while I recovered. Kevin live-streamed my awakening to his followers, calling it a miracle, and asking for donations to help with my continued care. He had gained 10,000 new followers in 3 days and was already planning merchandise, with inspirational quotes about never giving up. I watched him through half-closed eyes, my brain still foggy, but clear enough to be disgusted. The speech therapist helped me regain my voice slowly, starting with simple sounds and working up to words. My family eagerly waited for me to speak, hovering around my bed with barely concealed anticipation. When I finally managed my first full sentence asking for water, they acted like I had just delivered the Gettysburg Address. Mum immediately asked if I remembered anything about the accident about the months before. I shook my head weakly, pretending confusion. Thomas visited on my 4th day of consciousness, and my family surrounded him like hungry wolves. Dad tried to discuss power of attorney, while Mum asked about accessing funds for my care. Diana wanted to know about tax implications, and Marcus actually asked if the money was already invested and earning interest. Thomas politely but firmly stated that he would only discuss business with me directly once I was fully recovered. Maria managed to slip into my room that evening while my family was at dinner in the cafeteria. She had been banned from visiting, but the night nurses who had witnessed her months of dedication let her pass. She brought the journal she had kept, pressing it into my hands with tears in her eyes. She whispered that I needed to know the truth, that I deserved to know who had really been there for me. Before leaving, she kissed my forehead and promised she would be nearby if I needed her. I waited until I was alone that night to read Maria's journal. Each page was dated, detailing my family's absence, their excuses, their theft. She had documented every visit, every conversation she overheard, every lie they told. She had also written about our one-sided conversations, the books she read to me, the songs she sang. Her compassion and dedication filled the pages, a stark contrast to my family's abandonment. The next morning, I began my performance. When Dr. Martinez asked about my memory, I claimed significant gaps. I remembered the accident vaguely, I said, but the months before were fuzzy. When she mentioned my work, I looked confused. When Mum eagerly brought up my company, I stared at her blankly and asked what company. The relief on their faces was almost comical. I asked innocent questions that revealed their lies. When had they visited every single day, Mum claimed. Strange, I said, because I seemed to remember a woman's voice speaking Spanish. That was probably the cleaning staff, Diana quickly explained. What about the book someone read to me? Marcus jumped in, claiming credit for reading sports biographies, though Maria's journal clearly stated she had read mystery novels. Thomas returned with documents requiring my signature to release the funds from escrow. My family practically vibrated with anticipation as he explained the acquisition, the amount, the terms. I played dumb, asking him to explain everything multiple times, pretending to struggle with comprehension. Dad offered to help me understand, volunteering to review everything on my behalf. Thomas politely declined, stating that I seemed perfectly capable despite my memory issues. As my strength returned over the following week, I began requesting specific things to test my family's newfound devotion. Could someone bring my favorite soup from the restaurant across town? Diana complained about traffic but went. Would someone read to me from my favorite author? Marcus bought the wrong book but sat there pretending to read while actually watching sports highlights on his phone. Each request revealed their true feelings beneath the false concern. I asked the hospital administrator for a complete record of all visitors during my coma. The official logs showed exactly what Maria had documented. Weeks of absence, months of abandonment. When I presented this to my family, saying I was confused by the gaps, they scrambled for explanations. The system was faulty. They had visited during shift changes. The nurses must not have logged them properly. Each excuse was more desperate than the last. Dr. Ver. Martinez recommended another week of observation before discharge, and I agreed, using the time to plan my next moves. I had Thomas arrange for a new will, leaving 90% of my assets to various charities focused on medical care for abandoned patients. 5% would go to Maria specifically for her nursing education and her brother's college. The remaining 5% would be divided among my family members, but with strict conditions. They would only receive their inheritance if they completed 1,000 hours of volunteer service at hospitals, specifically in long-term care units. They would need to provide documentation references and prove they had actually served. Any attempt to falsify records would result in immediate forfeiture. Thomas drew up the documents with obvious pleasure, understanding exactly what I was doing. I also established a foundation called the Forgotten Patients Fund, designed to provide support and advocacy for coma patients whose families had abandoned them. Maria would serve on the board, along with several doctors and nurses who had witnessed my situation. The foundation would ensure that no patient would lie alone and forgotten the way I had been, except for one remarkable nurse's compassion. On my last night in the hospital, I called a family meeting. They arrived eagerly, probably expecting me to announce how I would divide my fortune among them. I had asked the nurses to set up a laptop connected to the room's television screen. They sat in a semicircle around my bed, leaning forward with barely contained greed. I began by thanking them for their recent support, watching them preen with false modesty. Then I played the security footage Maria had saved, showing my empty room day after day, week after week. I showed them the visitor logs, the records of Marcus's theft, the social media posts Kevin had made asking for money while claiming to be devastated. I presented Diana's vacation photos from the months she claimed to have been by my bedside. I showed them everything, watching their faces shift from confusion to shock to anger. Mum tried to speak, but I raised my hand for silence. I told them about the will, about the conditions for their inheritance, about the foundation I was establishing. I explained that the only reason they were getting anything at all was to give them a chance to understand what actual caregiving looked like, what real sacrifice and dedication meant. They would learn, or they would get nothing. Marcus stood up, his face red with rage, threatening to contest the will to sue for power of attorney based on my head injury. Thomas, who had been standing quietly in the corner, stepped forward and handed him a card for his law firm, welcoming any legal challenge. He mentioned that the security footage and documentation would make for interesting evidence in court, especially the theft from my accounts while I was incapacitated. Diana cried not the pretty tears from earlier, but ugly, angry sobs. She accused me of being ungrateful, of not understanding how hard it had been for them to see me that way. I asked her exactly how many times she had seen me that way, pulling up the visitor log that showed her 3 visits in 8 months. She had no answer, just more tears and accusations of cruelty. Kevin tried manipulation, telling me I was breaking Mom's heart, that family was supposed to forgive each other. I agreed that family was supposed to be there for each other, supposed to show up when times were hard, supposed to care for more than just money. I told him that he had 8 months to be family, and he had chosen to use my tragedy for social media clout instead. Dad said nothing throughout the confrontation, just stared at me with something between shame and calculation. Finally, he stood to leave and the others followed. At the door, he turned back and asked if I would have told them about the money if the accident hadn't happened. I answered honestly that I had planned to once the deal was finalised. I had wanted to share my success with my family. Now I knew that my success was the only thing about me they would have valued. Mum made one last attempt, approaching my bed with arms outstretched for a hug. I let her embrace me, feeling nothing but pity for a woman who could abandon her daughter so completely and then pretend such devotion when money appeared. She whispered that she loved me, and I whispered back that I knew exactly how much her love was worth down to the dollar. I left the hospital the next morning, driven by a car service Thomas had arranged to a temporary apartment he had also secured. Maria met me there, having taken the day off to help me settle in. She had brought groceries, filled the prescriptions I would need, and made sure everything was ready for my recovery. She did this not for money, not for recognition, but because she cared. The temporary apartment overlooked Buffalo Bayou, with floor-to-ceiling windows that let in abundant natural light. After 8 months in a hospital bed, every sensation felt overwhelming and new. The texture of real clothes against my skin, the taste of fresh fruit, the simple joy of choosing what to watch on television. Maria stayed that first day, making sure I could manage basic tasks and teaching me exercises to rebuild my strength. My recovery took months of physical therapy, occupational therapy, and psychological counseling to process both the trauma of the accident and the betrayal of my family. Some days the emotional pain exceeded the physical. Learning to walk steadily again seemed easier than learning to trust again. But each small victory, from climbing stairs to driving a car, rebuilt my confidence piece by piece. I sold my Houston condo and bought a house in California in Monterey near the ocean. The sound of waves became my meditation, the endless horizon reminding me that life was bigger than the small petty world my family had created. I hired a personal trainer who specialized in traumatic brain injury recovery, a nutritionist who designed meals to support healing, and a therapist who helped me process the complicated grief of losing people who were still alive. Maria visited, often flying in whenever her schedule allowed. She had accepted the money I offered with gracious humility, using it immediately to enroll in nurse practitioner courses and secure her brother's education. She never treated me like a benefactor, just a friend who had been fortunate enough to help another friend. Our relationship remained beautifully uncomplicated by the wealth that had complicated everything else. The Forgotten Patients Fund launched 6 months after I left the hospital. The first fundraiser raised $2 million, with several tech executives who had heard my story contributing generously. We hired care companions for 12 long-term coma patients in the first year, ensuring they received daily visits, exercise, and human connection. Maria served as our primary medical advisor, helping establish protocols that went beyond basic medical care to address human dignity. My family attempted various strategies to circumvent the will's requirements. Marcus hired a lawyer who quickly dropped the case after reviewing the evidence. Diana tried to negotiate, offering to do half the required hours for half the money. Kevin started volunteering, but was dismissed after being caught having other people sign in for him. Only Dad actually began completing the hours, though he never spoke to me again. Mum wrote me letters, long rambling things that alternated between accusation and pleading. She couldn't understand how I could be so cruel, so unforgiving. She rewrote history in each letter, creating elaborate justifications for their absence. I read each one carefully, then filed them away as evidence of how completely she missed the point. It was never about forgiveness. It was about truth. The acquisition money, even after the donations and the foundation, left me with more wealth than I could spend in several lifetimes. I lived modestly but comfortably traveled when I felt strong enough, and invested in small companies run by people who reminded me of myself before the accident, hungry and driven but lacking resources. I became the investor I had wished for during those long nights building my company. I ran into Diana once 2 years later at a restaurant in Houston where I was meeting with a potential foundation donor. She was dining with friends and our eyes met across the room. She looked older, harder, though her clothes were still expensive. She started to approach, but I shook my head slightly. She understood and returned to her table. We were strangers who happened to share DNA, nothing more. Kevin tried to reconnect through social media, sending messages about how he had changed, how he understood now what really mattered. His profile still showed the same pattern of exploitation, using our estrangement as content for his followers. He had pivoted to wellness influencing, claiming that losing his sister had taught him about mindfulness. I blocked him without responding. Marcus never attempted contact, but I heard through Thomas that he had gotten into legal trouble over gambling debts. Part of me felt sad for the brother I had once idolized as a child before I understood that his charm was manipulation and his promises were worthless. The money he had stolen from me while I lay dying would have been freely given if he had just stayed, just cared, just been present. Mum and Dad divorced 3 years after my accident. Without my money to fight over, they had to face what their marriage had actually become. Mum kept the house, but lost the country club membership she could no longer afford. Dad moved to Florida, starting over with another failed business venture. They had spent so much energy trying to get my money that they never noticed their own lives falling apart. Every year on the anniversary of my accident, I visit the hospital where I spent 8 months unconscious. I bring flowers for the ICU nurses, bonus checks for the staff who cared for me, and spend time with current long-term patients who have been abandoned by their families. I read to them, talk to them, ensure they know that someone sees them as human beings worthy of dignity and care. Maria completed her nurse practitioner degree with honors and now runs a clinic in an underserved area of Los Angeles. We have dinner once a month, sometimes talking about those 8 months, more often discussing her patients, my investments, or the latest mystery novel we have both read. She never asks for anything, which is why I ensure she never needs anything. The foundation has expanded to 15 hospitals across 4 states, with plans for national coverage within 5 years. We have reunited some families who had drifted away out of exhaustion rather than indifference, providing support and resources to help them stay connected. We have also provided comfort to dozens of patients who died without family present, ensuring their last days included human kindness. True family is not about blood or obligation or shared history. It is about showing up when showing up is hard, staying when staying is inconvenient, caring when caring offers no reward. I lost 8 months of my life in that hospital bed, but I gained something invaluable in return. I learned exactly who deserved a seat at my table, and that table only has room for those who were there when I had nothing to offer but myself. The money from the acquisition changed my life, but not in the way my family assumed it would. It gave me the freedom to see clearly, to choose deliberately, to surround myself with people who valued me rather than my bank account. It allowed me to transform abandonment into purpose, betrayal into wisdom, and loss into gain. $850 million could not buy me a loving family, but it could reveal that I never really had one to begin with. Some would call this story tragic, but I disagree. Tragedy is living your entire life surrounded by people who only see your worth in dollars and cents. Tragedy is never discovering who truly cares about you. I was given a gift wrapped in 8 months of darkness, a gift that illuminated everything. Now I live in the light of truth, painful but clear, surrounded not by family, but by something far more precious, genuine human connection. When people ask if I have forgiven my family, I tell them forgiveness is not the right word. I understand them now, their limitations, their shallow capacity for love, their transactional view of relationships. Understanding is not the same as excusing, and acceptance is not the same as reconciliation. They are who they have always been. The accident and the money simply revealed it. Sometimes in quiet moments by the ocean, I think about the woman I was before the accident, desperately seeking approval from people incapable of giving it. She worked so hard to earn love that should have been freely given, sacrificed so much for family, who saw her as nothing more than a resource to be exploited. I mourn for her sometimes, for all those years of hoping for something different, but mostly I am grateful. Grateful for Maria's kindness, for Thomas's integrity, for the doctors who saved my life, for the second chance to build something meaningful. Grateful even for the coma that stripped away all pretense and showed me exactly where I stood with the people who should have loved me most. The truth, even when it hurts, is always a gift. My name is Adela, 40 years old now, and I am no longer anyone's ATM, anyone's backup plan, anyone's last resort. I am a survivor, a philanthropist, a friend, and a woman who knows exactly what real love looks like, because I experienced its absence so completely. That is worth more than $850 million. That is worth everything. What would you have done in my situation? Would you have forgiven and shared the wealth, or would you have protected yourself from those who only showed up when money was involved? I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If this story resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe for more real-life stories of triumph over betrayal. Share this with someone who needs to hear that their worth is not measured in dollars, but in the love they give and receive. Thank you for listening to my journey, and remember, family is not about blood. It is about who shows up when life knocks you down. Until next time, choose your table wisely and fill it only with those who would sit there even if it was empty.